This is a very good bill, Mr Speaker, and I recommend it to the House. Thank you.
Split call. Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm happy to take a short call on this bill. I don't think there's anyone in this House, and the speeches that we've heard this morning have indicated that anyone in this House who doesn't think that it's a very sensible idea for us to enact this legislation, that it will make life much easier for many people. And I think there is no one in this House that thinks that a single person, an elderly person who finds themselves in circumstances where they need to relieve the single person's allowance needs to go through any bureaucratic hassle in terms of accessing that payment. So Labor is happy to support this bill, and it is happy to congratulate what is sensible legislation and to make sure that this is no longer an issue for our elderly people. And it's really good to see that we have taken this sensible approach, that our elderly are protected from policy and that we have policies that are in place that have ensured that we have seen the hardship rate for older New Zealanders has in fact remained relatively low and relatively flat. So it's not only the relatively low bit, but it's the relatively flat bit that we haven't seen hardship increasing for our elderly people. And it's remained relatively low and flat at around 4 to 5%. But unfortunately, this hasn't been the case for children in our country, which has risen from 15% in 2007 to 21% in 2011. So we'd actually like to see sensible approaches that would address issues that would mean that our children weren't living in hardship, and it's a matter of working together like we're seeing in this legislation. Now, we have heard some chipping across the House. I guess it's the last day of sitting for the year, and we've been accused of cherry-picking legislation and that we should have some consistency on what we should support. Well, there's a couple of responses to that. One we are the opposition. We are not going to agree with everything you do. But secondly, we are happy to support sensible legislation when you put it up. In fact, we would welcome you putting up more sensible legislation. More sensible, we would welcome the opposition, Mr Speaker. I'm sure you would only put up sensible legislation. We would welcome we would welcome the government putting up more sensible legislation that did address many of the hardships that we're seeing in this country. We would welcome the government putting up legislation that did something to address the ever-climbing unemployment rate that we see in this country. Unfortunately, too many New Zealanders are heading into this Christmas period with no job and are not seeing a merry time for them and their families, and they have a government that has done nothing over the last 12 months to address those issues. But as my colleague did after talking about some of the broader issues of our economy, I will return to the legislation and the reasons why we are happy to support it. We are happy to support it because what we have seen is a good approach to it, and we have also seen that some of the concerns that have been heard at the committee stage need to be taken into account. That we have heard that there are real practical things that we can do to improve this legislation. And one of the issues we have heard is around student allowances and the way in which that we need to clear up whether there are distinctions that will have unintended and unfair consequences. And we need to take a very practical approach to that. So for example, where a child is over the age of 18 but may have an intellectual disability and be classified as dependent, or when a child is temporarily unable to support themselves. Also, this policy is inconsistent with the student allowance policy, which I mentioned earlier, where a young person is still means tested on their parents' incomes until they're 24 years of age, thereby classifying them as dependent, and we do not believe that these issues are adequately addressed in this bill. So we would like to see some of these other issues addressed. We also have some concerns about this bill that we're putting up amendments at the committee stage, so that's one of them, but we're also concerned that a provision in the bill relating to dependent children may not take into account the diverse range of situations. But on the whole, Labor is happy to support this sensible piece of legislation.
Catherine Delahunty.